Because what I'm going to do this afternoon is, I think, the agenda was ordered quite carefully. And so this morning we had a look at the macro kind of levels, the community levels, and understanding and research on community factors in as regards disaster recovery and risk. And this afternoon I'm going to move, as Tom alluded to, the smaller levels, the more micro levels of the individual and the family, and specifically the individual child and his caregiving environment. So I'm also going to talk. So I think I'm the only prevention researcher, intervention researcher here. I'm also going to talk a little bit about prevention and treatment, and I'm going to pick up on something actually you said, Doug, earlier: evidence-based practice. And my goal here is to make a connection among the content here, the content being research into resilience, specifically resilience of children, and that association with family functioning, specifically of parents, in the wake of traumatic stressors. So I'm not going to use the term disaster, I'll use a broader term, traumatic stressors that can include both disaster and non-disaster trauma. I'll talk a little bit about prevention and intervention research, and specifically, how do we establish the efficacy and effectiveness of practices that we hope will promote healthy adjustment or resilience among those affected by disasters. And I'm going to give you an example. And I love to talk about implementation, but I know, I was telling Saab earlier, I always come with 90 slides, and then I have to cut them in half, and I never get to implementation. So I won't be able to talk about that today, but please, if you're interested in widespread implementation and the emerging science known as implementation science, I would be very, very happy to talk with you, and that refers to sort of widespread implementation of evidence-based practices. So let's talk a little bit, let's just define our terms. So when I talk about resilience and we take it down to the individual level, I'm talking about children's resilience, and I'm talking about I'm channeling Anne Maston, whose video you're going to see on Thursday afternoon. I'm talking about a pattern of positive adaptation against a backdrop of adversity. That is, when we talk about resilience, we're not talking about anything beyond doing okay. But it is the fact that the children and families that we are talking about have experienced adversity, disasters, other traumatic events, that we call somebody who's doing okay in this situation resilient. Okay? And in the wake of a traumatic event, we're talking about the capacity to recover functioning. So one of the things we know is that a key correlate of resilience is effective parenting. And so I've chosen to study parenting as the vehicle through which we can promote children's resilience, based on the fact that we have many years, 50 years of developmental studies that show that parents are crucial to children's resilience. So interestingly enough, in low-risk circumstances, where there's not much bad stuff going on, and families have enough money, and you can be an okay parent. You can even be a not so good parent, and it doesn't really matter, your kid will be okay. But when stressful and traumatic events happen, parenting becomes absolutely crucial. So let me just talk a little bit now about prevention. I'm not going to spend a long time on it, but just some terminology. So we talked a little bit about multiple levels, multi-system approaches. How many of you would call yourselves in the public health field, apart from Doug and Sarb? Yeah, okay, so a few of you are in public health. So in public health, we take universal approaches to prevention, whole population approaches, like immunizations would be a really good example, getting people to wear seatbelts in the cars. What were you?
Teaching the healthy diet.
Healthy diet, things like that, HIV prevention, things like that. We talk about selective prevention when we select a subpart of the population based on a specific risk that is, that is relevant in their segment. For example, In the US, there's a lot of work on preventing problems among children whose parents have divorced. That would be an example of selective prevention. I do selective prevention. My work is with families who are made homeless, families affected by domestic violence, families affected by war. And then indicated or tertiary prevention is also called early intervention, and that refers to when you take a subpopulation and you try and intervene with them and they are already displaying some of the early signs of the problem behaviors that you're trying to prevent. Conduct problems would be an easy example. After any bad thing that happens, what typically you see in the population, and I'll give you an example of children growing up in high-risk neighborhoods, for example, or kids of divorcing families, very sort of commonplace, at least in the Western, in the US. But many examples have shown that after something bad happens, about a third of the people do fine, right? A third of the people do really badly, and the other third are kind of in the middle. And the goal of prevention programs is to do no harm to the people who would be okay anyway. And that's an important thing, because sometimes we find that the practices that we try actually do harm. So it's not an assumption that if something looks good, it won't do any harm, it'll be okay, right? Face validity is not good enough. There's a very famous example in the United States of a drug abuse prevention program called DARE that looked like it's okay. It tells kids not to use drugs, right? It was a very widely used educational curriculum in the schools to stop children trying drugs. It didn't work. Not only did it not work, but actually in some cases it encouraged children to try drugs when they would not otherwise have done that. So it's very important that we test programs. So we want to make sure that they do no harm to the population that would otherwise be okay, and they prevent the later emergence of problems among children who are at risk. And we test programs, we use 3 levels of testing programs to make sure that they work. I'm going to focus on the middle one today. So efficacy testing refers to, you try a program out and you test it under the most highly controlled conditions. So people were talking earlier about cognitive behavior therapy, say, that would be treatment. So if you wanted to do an efficacy study of trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, you would try it in your lab. You would have your graduate students deliver the practice. You would only test it with children who have PTSD, but nothing else. No behavior problems, no other kinds of messy stuff. And that's what's called efficacy testing. And the rationale is you have to find out under the best conditions whether something works. Because if it doesn't work under the best conditions, it won't work under messy everyday conditions. Actually, interestingly enough, people are less and less using efficacy trials because people say, but real-world conditions are messy. Why would we bother testing something first under ideal conditions? It's an interesting debate. The second is effectiveness testing. And there the idea is you test a program in real-world conditions. If to take the same example of cognitive behavior therapy, you go into a regular clinic in the community, you train clinicians, therapists to deliver cognitive behavioral therapy, you do a randomized control trial. You're always doing randomized control trials. That's the best, the gold standard. And then if the kids who are randomly assigned to receive cognitive behavioral therapy do better than the other kids, then great, your intervention works. And then the last is something that actually earlier, one of the groups I was talking about, we were saying this is the least studied, and sadly I won't talk a lot about it today, and that's implementation. Because what happens is often you develop and test a program. Now that's very difficult in and of itself. You find it to be effective. And then you say, oh, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy is effective. We should make sure that everybody in every clinic in, say, Sri Lanka has access to trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Actually, sadly, even if something has been found to be effective, right, that's just the very first tiny stage. Getting it into communities is often much harder than getting it tested in the first place. It's a science. What are the factors? And that's where we get back to the community level variables. Because whether a good program is actually ever used at all depends on so many different variables, not simply at the individual level, but at the agency level, at the community level, at the state level, country level as well. Okay, so that's by way of introduction about the way we test programs and the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about. Let me get back to the content area. Let me just tell you a little bit about trauma and parenting, because that will help me to give you a rationale for why I study what I study. And by the way, Tom, how long do I have? I have till 2:45?
Yes.
Because I started a bit late. 2:55, something like that. Okay. 53, how about that? So why are we interested in trauma and parenting and children's adjustment? What do we know, and why is development important here? In early childhood, as many of you know, the key one of the most important social, emotional developmental tasks is to develop a healthy attachment with a primary caregiver. So that's the first few years of life. And we know from many, many years of research, some conducted at my own institution by some fantastic researchers, that early attachment relationship forms a foundation for all the later relationships we have. And as children grow older, for example, 4, 5, 6 years old, the tasks that they have to accomplish shift. So somebody tell me, in your countries, what happens when a child is 5 or 6 years old? What are the things they have to be doing? School. There you go. Okay. So when you go to school, what are the things that you need to have in order to be successful? What skills must you develop to be successful in school? Communication, socialization, right? Very, very important. And actually, so you have to be able to sit down when the teacher tells you to sit down. You have to be able to, in America we say use your listening ears, right? You have to be able to comply. It used to be thought that the best way to get ready for school is to learn your ABCs and your 1, 2, 3s. Actually, that's not the case. The best predictor of school readiness is social emotional, is the capacity to be able to regulate your body and your emotions, not when you get angry with another child because they took the book you want, hit them over the head, right? To be able to get along with other kids, those are very important predictors of school. This is the developmental stage I'm going to be focusing on. And I have 2 key research questions. One is, so how does effective parenting influence children's recovery from traumatic events? What role exactly? So we know that good parenting is correlated with resilience, and we know that from very many well-established longitudinal studies. But what are the mechanisms under which, after a traumatic event, parenting is helpful in getting children back on their feet? And similarly, how do parents' own experience of traumatic events affect their parenting? So if a parent has been through a war or an experience of domestic violence or a disaster, and often, of course, disasters, parents and children go through these together, right? But how do parents' reactions to traumatic events affect their own parenting? So I'm going to use a theoretical model called social interaction learning, and I'm not going to spend a long time talking about it, but essentially this model suggests that children learn from the social interactions they have with parents, right? So that, for example, when a parent, because he or she has not maybe been parented him or herself, has never learned how to be a parent, doesn't have a model for what a good parent is, engages in a very series of many negative interactions with a child, what we would call coercive interactions. For example, Norden, do you want to play with me? You'll be spicy child. So let's say I come home and I am a single mother, very tired, and I come in and Norden has his feet up and he's watching the television. And I say, Norden, why didn't you do your homework? What do you say?
I'll do it later, Mom.
You always say you'll do it later, and your teacher told me you never do your homework. Go do your homework now.
I never my dinner first.
No, you will not. I'm going to take away your dinner because you don't do your homework. Go do your homework now.
Okay, Mom.
Oh, I won! Okay, did you say I lost? Yes. Okay, so why did I lose? Why did I lose that conflict bout? Why did I lose?
You were not able to communicate with him. You were forcing him.
Okay, so how did I win? How did I
By
win?
forcing, by authority.
Well, I abused my authority.
Abuse.
I bullied him,
Yeah,
right?
you bullied.
We escalated. I told him in a pretty negative way. He escalated, I escalated, he escalated. I escalated by telling him he wouldn't get any dinner, and then finally he backed down.
Yeah.
So what have I learned as a parent? How many times do parents, maybe this never happens in your countries, only in the United States. How many times do parents say, I have to shout if I want anything? Okay, so that would be an example of a coercive or negative interaction. And what we know is that, this is coercive parenting, and I gave you an example through escalation, but there are many ways in which these external things increase coercive interactions, which ultimately negatively affects child adjustment. And these things could be many things. It could be maternal depression, for example, is a very big predictor of negative parenting practices. It could be parent exposure. My hypothesis is that parent exposure to traumatic stresses also increases this. But we know that marital transitions like divorce and step parenting, we know that poverty, we know that lack of skills, low education, increase coercive parenting. The good news, though, is that at the same time as negative coercive parenting makes children more likely to be antisocial, to get into criminal problems, to be depressed, to get arrested, to use drugs, we also know that if you implement positive parenting practices, then you will protect children from negative, stressful events. Now, there's an interesting cultural question here about whether the exact same parenting practices are positive and negative parenting practices are relevant culturally, or which specific parenting practices are culturally relevant for improving children's adjustment. But I have never come across anyone who denies that these kinds of positive parenting practices promote kids' resilience. Ultimately, and I'm talking about things like when children do positive things, when children do things that they're supposed to do. For example, when Norden said, tell me you did your homework.
I finished my homework, Mom.
Good job. Or if he sets the table for me because he sees I'm tired, and I say thank you, right? Or I say, your teacher told me that you did well in your class. I'm so proud of you. Okay. Now, of course, across all cultures, we differ in our emotional expression, but ultimately, what do these kinds of positive interactions teach a child? Encouragement.
Reinforcement. Positive reinforcement.
Beautiful. I didn't even plant you there. But positive reinforcement encourages the kinds of behavior that we are targeting. And I believe it's a universally powerful way of teaching children what is appropriate, and it's not the only way. There are many, and I just gave you one example. There are many other positive parenting practices. Effective discipline, monitoring children, knowing what they're doing where, teaching children problem-solving skills, etc. Okay. So we did a study where we took a group of mothers who had, with their children, escaped from a very bad situation where they were being abused, beaten. And we recruited them either from a shelter or from the court. And we followed them in a very short time. We did we assessed them at 3 time points over 8-week period using observations, and we measured mothers' parenting practices according to the kinds of things that I've been talking to you about. And what we found was that the mothers who at baseline, just a week after the terrible event, had, or series of events, had more effective positive parenting, those mothers had children who recovered, i.e. showed reduced distress, much more quickly. So we think about the kinds of behaviors that I just told you about, positive parenting things as reinforcement for good behavior, but actually they seem to have some kind of a protective effect also for distress, which is a very important element of children's reactions after a disaster. The other part of this is what happens to parents, right? And so we did a study looking at a very, very different population where we looked at the post-traumatic stress symptoms among fathers who had been who had been fighting in the war. The U.S., of course, has been involved in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we sampled 500 fathers who both when they were in Iraq and also when they came back a year later. And what we found was that growth in fathers' post-traumatic stress disorder was associated with parenting impairments a year later. So this is what fathers are telling us, that their post-traumatic stress symptoms are really impairing their ability to be able to be present, provide positive reinforcement, consistent discipline with their children. And this is just a self-report study. We're learning more and more about what happens actually when you observe people. So what we know, what's really interesting is that in the trauma research around the world, there's been a lot of focus on post-traumatic stress, for example, and the association of post-traumatic stress symptoms, PTSD, in parents and in children, but not very little thought as to how it happens, right? So how is it that parents with PTSD are likely to have children with PTSD? Is it genetic? Is it environment, likely an interaction? But how does it happen, right? What are the kinds of ways in which parents who have PTSD do their parenting so that their children are more vulnerable, for example? Very little research. So why should we be thinking about this study? Because parents are really central to children's recovery, and they're often, as many of you know, in how many of your countries do all children have easy access to a psychologist? None, right? None, right? How many of you live in environments where most children have access to a parent? Okay, yeah, mostly. So my research and the research of my colleagues is focused on what we can do to support parents to strengthen their children's resilience. By the way, the other good news of this is that we do know, I didn't mention this in the diagram, but the model I showed you, social interaction learning, is a model that has been under study for about 40 years. And the good news is that if you strengthen parents' parenting, you do show improvements in children's behavior. So this is a very, very important thing. We're not starting from something new. We're building on a foundation of 40 years of research that shows that actually parenting is malleable with intervention. Did you have a question? No? Okay. So the other thing is, the other clue that we have in terms of thinking about populations of families after disasters or other traumatic events is that actually these programs to promote parenting don't just show improvements in child behavior, but also in depression and in stress regulation. So for example, there was a long-standing study I'll share with you that showed that if you teach mothers effective parenting, you have children who are less depressed. That's a good thing, as well as showing better behavior. And also, there was a really, really innovative study done by Phil Fisher and his colleagues that trained foster parents. These are very young children who had been removed for abuse and neglect, and the homes that they were put into, they trained the parents. And actually what was so interesting was that they found not only behavioral improvements, but when they assessed the children's cortisol, stress hormone levels, they found that many of them had originally had very unusual, non-normal levels of diurnal daily cortisol, but the intervention flipped that and flipped those daily cortisol patterns to normative. Okay, I'm going to be really behind in time, so I'm going to really try and speed this up. Essentially, what we know is that and we know this through many years of studying, using, and I'm just going to give, this is a one parent training model, but it's the most well-known or well-validated parent training model. And it originated in Oregon in the United States. It's called Parent Management Training, the Oregon model. And it's a model that has been rigorously tested and essentially shows that if you provide, that parenting mediates the relationship between family stress and child adjustment, and you can actually moderate the mediator by training parents in effective parenting practices. You can improve child adjustment, and you actually don't need to do anything with the child, right? You don't provide an intervention to the child, just the parent, and indeed, when you provide an intervention to the parent, the child benefits. And the child benefits, and this is data from a 9-year study that was done of divorcing mothers and children, with a 14-week parent training intervention, 1.5 hours a week. Mothers were invited. It was a random assignment. 238 mothers and their kindergarten to third grade children, and half of those mothers were randomly assigned to be invited to a 14-week, 90 minutes a week parenting intervention. 9 years later, the mothers who were randomly assigned to the program showed maintained improvements, which began from 12 months post-baseline and continued through 9 years. So what happened was the mother's parenting did improve, the children's depression reduced, the behaviors improved. Those kids whose mothers went through the intervention showed less substance abuse, fewer arrests. And then 9 years later, the mothers in the intervention group were earning more money, had higher education and better jobs than the mothers in the control group. It's really interesting, not what had been predicted. So one important thing, let me just make a quick comment about methods. We want to be doing, when we're looking to see whether a program changes people's behaviors, we don't just want to rely on what they tell us. And too often that happens. Too often we rely on studies that are cross-sectional and use one person to tell us all the things that are wrong and all the things that changed. We want what we call multi-method, multi-informant, and multi-setting data. We would like to gather data from people's homes and from children's schools, from parents, both parents if possible, and the child and the teacher. We want to gather behavior, we want to gather data on what we see, observational data, what's under the skin, physiological and genetic data. I think that's what Rainer's talk yesterday also sort of addressed. And when we do that, we really get a much sort of more comprehensive idea of what's going on. It's hard to do, it's complicated, it's costly, but actually now we're experimenting with cheaper ways to do it. For example, gathering observational data online, right? Having parents fill out questionnaires online, but also using other kinds of ways, so using webcams to capture what happens in a home, or showing parents videos and asking them to respond, things like that. So I'm going to skip these, but these just show shows the standard of living improvement that I told you about and the effect sizes. Let me just skip quickly to our work with looking at whether you can improve parenting under conditions where parents have been exposed to traumatic events. And there are many different stages. This is research that can take a long time. But I think this is applicable to when you're thinking about a new culture, a new context, a new stressor. And I think I heard some of you talking about that this morning, that you want to think about, okay, what's applicable to my culture and my context? You want to try out your ideal intervention, whether it's a CBT that's taken from, a intervention that was developed in Europe, say, or whether it's a new intervention. You want to try it out and see whether people come, right? Whether they like it. That's what we call feasibility. And then you want to test whether it's effective or not, okay? So you have many different stages where you want to see whether an intervention works or not. And this intervention, I'm only going to show you one study, but this intervention we've looked at with families exposed to domestic violence and homelessness, immigrant families fleeing war. And what I'm going to share with you is a study that we did of military families where a parent was deployed to combat in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's what we call trauma-informed parent management training. And we take, we add a couple of theoretical frameworks that I won't go into much now, but the idea is that if a parent, like think about the parents that you are familiar with in your country or context, who have been through a typhoon or an earthquake, right? Everybody has some level of post-traumatic stress symptoms, whether or not they meet the threshold for PTSD. So you hear something that reminds you of the event, right? Your heart beats faster, or you startle more easily, or you get angry quicker. Basically, your emotions are dysregulated. So one of the things we knew was that we had to address some issues around emotion regulation. That's the first thing. And then the other thing is, and it'll be interesting to hear what people say in their culture, is what parents do about the fact that their children are also really scared. Okay? So in our population, very, very different from the things that you're dealing with, we have parents who come home from Iraq and Afghanistan and they think, my kids don't need to worry about me anymore, right? But you can't just switch off your worry, right? So all the time the father, usually it's the father, sometimes the mother was in the war. Every day the children worried, they had nightmares, and they went to sleep with the other parent who was home. They stayed in the bed, and when the parent comes back, the anxiety doesn't dissipate, right? It stays very, very, very high. And my guess is that this would be even more powerful after like an earthquake or a typhoon or tsunami. Is it going to come back, Mom? Is it going to, what do I do? And children, anxiety is a very big problem. So we need to address that if we're going to support parenting. We need to help parents think about what to do about their children's anxiety. So there are a few additions here we made to the parenting program that we pulled from, which was not originally focused on trauma and anxiety. Our program's called ADAPT, After Deployment Adaptive Parenting Tools. In the United States, 2 million children have had a parent go to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's a huge number. And half of these children have parents in what we call the National Guard. These are not regular soldiers. So how many of you have a reserve army in your country? Okay, right. So it's very common. They're regular people, they go to regular jobs, and once a year they go to do army training. Right? And when there's a war, they get called up. But in the United States, never before these wars had the reserve soldiers been called up to this extent. We have families where there are children, 10-year-old children, 5 years of their life, their parents have been gone in war. It's really a big, interesting, big problem. And so what we did was we are running a 5-year study to test a parenting program in this context. If we provide a parenting program to parents where a father or a mother has come back from the war after having been exposed to many traumatic events like explosive devices along the road, many more people have been injured and come back from this war than previous wars, because battlefield medicine is very good. So people who would have died, now they're living with disabilities. High rates of post-traumatic stress, sometimes above 20%, come back with meeting clinical criteria of PTSD. So we recruited 336 families. That's about 1,000 people. Each family, mother, father, child, or with some single families. And then we randomly assigned them 60% to be invited to participate in a parenting program, 40% to receive other kinds of parenting services. And we had parents and children and teachers complete questionnaires, observational data, and physiological and genetic data at baseline, and then 6, 12, and 24 months later. We were interested in the effect of the program on children's adjustment and on parenting and other things like emotion regulation. And I'm going to show you just some preliminary, this is really fun, you'll love this. He's looking at me like, are you crazy? But I just want to show you relationships at baseline. At baseline, in fact, what we found was that parenting practices observed were associated with parent, teacher, and child report of children's adjustment, and then how the parents reported they got along with each other, and also how we observed them to get along with each other was associated with how they parented, in turn with child adjustment, Mother's post-traumatic stress symptoms was associated with her parenting, but not father's. But both mother's and father's post-traumatic stress was associated with children's adjustment. We have a 14-week program that teaches key parenting skills that I've talked to you about and also delivers material online. And this, we were talking a little bit about how you get people to change behavior. And I said, I think there's only one really significant thing that changes parents' behavior, and that is not only one, but one very important thing, and that is practice, right? If you want to do something different, you've got to practice. And so most of our program is focused on helping parents to practice and to go home and practice new behaviors. And I'm just going to show you what we did. We evaluated the program's effectiveness at baseline, at 6 and 12 months after baseline. And what I'm going to show you today is data on actually 4 different outcomes. 3 that we thought about and 1 that we didn't think about, but someone asked us about, so we looked at it. And I want to just say that these are interim analyses because we've not completed the study yet. We looked at the program's effect on self-parenting, self-efficacy, and Doug this morning talked a little bit about, you talked more about community efficacy, but we know that self-efficacy, how you feel as a parent, how you feel competent as a parent, is very good. In our earlier studies, it's associated with later observed improvements in parenting. So we asked parents 6 months after baseline, just a few weeks after the end of the program, how they felt about their parenting, of course at baseline as well. And then we asked parents to rate their effectiveness at discipline. That was 12 months later. And then we observed their parenting at 12 months post-baseline. And the other thing we did was someone asked us if we are having an effect on parents' PTSD symptoms. I thought you might be interested, so I'll show that to you as well. The effect of the intervention on parenting self-efficacy. And as you can see, and we have, mostly we have 2 parents in one family. So when you do analysis, you have to account for the fact that the mother and the father are somehow related, right? They're related. There's going to be some issues around the fact that these are what we call nested data. Parents are nested within families. And what you see is that there is an intent to treat main effect on post-test locus of control, which is the same as efficacy, controlling for baseline. And ITT, anyone know what ITT means? Has anyone heard of ITT? Intent to treat, yes. You want to tell us what it means?
It's design in randomized
Mm-hmm.
but we just measure the effect in whole the tool.
So, right. So once randomized, always analyzed. Okay, which means that as soon as somebody is in the one group, the intervention group, control group, we always analyze them. But bear in mind that in prevention studies, we had 207 families we invited to come to the parenting group. Typically, you get about 70% to show up, if you're lucky, in selective and indicated prevention. So you're analyzing the data of everybody, even though not everybody actually showed up. Why are you doing that? Anyone know?
We could not hear the question.
Oh, why would you analyze, why would you compare both groups, everybody in both groups, even if only 70% of the people in your intervention group showed up to participate in the program?
So the control group.
I'm sorry?
So maybe those who did not show up can serve as your control group?
Actually, we don't have them serve as our control group. That's a good question. Sometimes you would think, oh, they could be our control group. No, you don't. Anyone know why? Go for it, Tom.
Keeps the 2 groups that you started with, which are comparable to each other because of random assignment, it keeps that random assignment preserved. If you were to analyze only those who got the treatment to which they were assigned, then they would be a different population of people than those in the control group.
So, right.
It would be a confound.
So, for example, maybe the people who showed up, the 70% who showed up, are more motivated to change than the people who didn't show up. So if I only take the 70% who showed up, it's not really a fair comparison because they're more highly motivated, right? So, but it's a conservative test because how can you expect somebody to change if they never showed up to the program, right? So you're expecting that the 70% to kind of carry the weight for the group, okay? Anyway, so we also looked at poor discipline as reported by parents, and this was after a year, right? So after about 8 months of finishing the program, and we found that we had a main effect of the intervention. If you were assigned to the intervention group, to the ADAPT program, you were more likely to show a decrease in poor discipline than the control group, and this shows This shows basically that the mothers, there was more change in the mothers than there was in the fathers. And then finally we looked at observed parenting practices from baseline to 12 months. And what we found was a significant effect on improvements in mothers' parenting, but by the way, not in fathers' parenting. So I was interested by this because we found, because more mothers showed up than fathers, but not very many more, it was about 52% mothers, 48% fathers. We're still trying to figure out what's going on. We think that mothers probably care more about parenting. They spend more time parenting. Fathers, most of whom have been away from many years of a child's life, don't have much practice parenting. Maybe we didn't give them an opportunity to have enough practice in parenting. What was really interesting, though, was we looked at maybe there are some other things going on here. What we did actually find, sorry about this messy diagram, was that the fathers who had worse parenting at baseline actually did improve as a function of the intervention. That's a moderated effect here by baseline risk. And, one second, unobserved, I'm sorry. Here it is, this one, okay? And then we also found that we had, and then that observed parenting was associated with improvements in the children's behavior as reported by the mothers after 12 months. So that was good. We also showed, though, that, I'm sorry, let me just step back. What I just told you was wrong. So we hypothesized that it would be the change in parenting that would be associated with children's behavior. And in fact, we did see that with the mothers. However, that wasn't the case with the fathers. So we thought, what is accounting for the change in child behavior? If it's not the parenting, what could it be in the fathers? In the mothers, if you improve parenting, you see reductions in children's behavior problems, but not in fathers. So we looked at something else, which was, I told you that we are teaching people how to regulate their emotions. And we assessed father mindfulness now. And what we found was that you see an effect of the intervention, not just on observed parenting practices, but also on change in mindfulness or emotion regulation. And it is that change that seems to be associated with a reduction in behavior problems. Let me just caveat that by saying that really what we want to do is see this. This is gathered at 12 months, and so is this. So we want to see this change at 24 months so we can really follow a longitudinal path. So I'll just finish with my last slide, which is really interesting, which shows that also the program has a main effect on mothers' post-traumatic stress symptoms, which we were really surprised at. We weren't really surprised at, but we were pleased with. But no one's shown that if you improve someone's parenting, you actually can make them feel better, like fewer post-traumatic stress symptoms. There's probably a lot of different explanations, but if you teach a mother to be, be a more effective parent, maybe she makes her feel better, she can see improvements in her children, maybe she's less anxious and the anxiety. And we're also teaching, very important element of parenting is emotion regulation. And if you can improve emotion regulation, you can probably reduce PTSD symptoms. Okay, I'll stop there.
in the communal society, sometimes the parenting is going to the extended family, the grandparents, the uncles, the aunties, and especially in disaster area, the one that we experience that I work with is that the children in the tent, in the refugee, is usually they have multiple parents during the refugee. So how to implement?
Yeah. It's a great question. Thank you for asking that question. And actually, we're collaborating on a study in China on the population of left behind children, children whose parents migrate to the cities for work, and the children are left behind in the care of grandparents or teachers, and we're testing it there. We've done also in parts of the US where children, this has been done with children in other settings, also where grandparents are involved. I think the biggest challenge you have for children where there are many people parenting them is whether all the people who are parenting them are saying the same thing, right? Right, so one of the things we call a united parenting front. And I think it's really crucial. So one of the things that our parents tell us, you have a father who was gone for a year or 2 or 3, and you have a mother who's been home, and getting back on the same page, right, is really hard. And I think it's probably even a little more complicated when you've got 8 or 9 people doing the parenting, right? So I think that's a really, I would say if you're working with this kind of a situation, you would really want to beef up the united parenting front. So how would you do this? Would you do this? We have multiple family groups, right, where we have 6 to 10 families in one group. But maybe when you have 8 or 9 caregivers, maybe you just have one group of all the people in the child's life, right? But anyway, yes, I think it's very relevant. The skills are no different, but you have to just make, one of the crucial things is the united parenting front.
I wanted to know if there was a full effect or partial effect of the mediating variable.
So we haven't, okay, so that's a really good question. And when you say the mediating variable, what do you specifically?
The parenting.
Right. So did we test that? Yes, great question. Did we test whether there was a mediating effect? You're talking about the baseline data, right? This nasty little thing I had here. Yes.
Parenting practices.
This is, right. So we did find an indirect effect. But remember, you can't really talk about a mediator. Well, I've got the methodologists behind me, but this is all cross-sectional data. So that's the first thing, is I'm not going to talk about a true mediating effect with cross-sectional data. But yes, we did test for the indirect effect.
Okay, thank you. Very good.
No, great question. Yeah. Okay, who else?
I have one question. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. Professor, I just wanted to know, now you said there was a difference observed between fathers and mothers once you adopted this. So could it be due to the mothers mostly responding towards kids in a more emotional manner? Or what were the findings? And then you also mentioned the other variable that you captured was mindfulness of the father when it was captured and it was increased. Is that correct? Yes. That there was a clear reduction of maladaptive behavioral patterns in kids. So could you explain it a little bit more? Like, what are the causative factors for these kind of behaviors?
I wish I could tell you what the causative factors were. I'll leave that to my causal modeling person here. No, I mean, I think it's really interesting because mostly, first of all, people who study parenting usually study mothers. Hardly anyone looks at fathers. So that's, I think, the first thing. So we were really intrigued to see that we didn't have the same effects on fathers as we did on mothers. I think it seems to be, again, this is preliminary data, that the key variable for fathers, desired outcome variable for fathers is emotion regulation, and for mothers it's parenting. I'm totally in the area of guesswork here, but based on what I know and what we saw, mothers, like I said, they're very motivated to improve their parenting, and they get a lot of practice because they're the people who the children go to. The fathers, when they come home from war, right, and they have some level of post-traumatic stress symptoms, even if they don't meet criteria for having PTSD, they're much more sensitive, right, to the things that go on in the home. I have a colleague who says the family is the crucible for strong emotions. If strong emotions happen, it's going to be in the family, right, more than outside. So things happen, for example, the children make a noise, and then the father, he goes very, very angry, shouts, screams, yells, hits them, things like that. Because of the PTSD symptoms, right? Because noise, for example, and any of you who've, I should imagine, particularly with an earthquake, for example, right? Noise, the things that you hear in a traumatic event really are triggers for later difficult responses. So in one situation, for example, the father, he had been in 3 tours in Afghanistan, and when he came back after the 3rd tour, his wife, who turned out happened to be a facilitator for us, said, I can't have him at home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon because when the children come home from school and they drop their backpacks on the floor, he goes, it's a trigger for him. He goes crazy. He screams and yells at them because of the noise. So I think what happens with the fathers is if we can help them lower the emotional dysregulation a little bit, the household is much more relaxed and the kids do better.
How did you increase their mindfulness? Like, what are the techniques used?
We had every single session, we had between 2 minutes and 20 minutes of mindfulness practice. We had all the exercises available online. Everyone could download them to their smartphone and do them at home. And we didn't encourage, it wasn't a specific meditation. We used like mindful eating, we used yoga, we used sitting meditations, body scans. But, so for example, one of the fathers said he said, when I go for a run, I don't put my headphones on. Instead, I focus on feeling the ground beneath my feet, listening to the birds in the trees. And those kinds of skills allow that father to be present for his children. That's what we're trying to teach.
Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more?
Yeah, there's one here.
Oh, sorry. Go.
Thank you, Professor, for the inspirational research. I'm asking you about children who are witnessing the violence, because exposure to domestic violence has significant negative repercussions to children, not just emotional, but also social and also academic. In Jakarta, we try to develop an approach to mitigating this deleterious effect, but we find a barrier to access this target population because of occurrence of domestic violence remain in the family secrecy in many households. So, based on your huge experience in violence, how to strategy to overcome this barrier? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. It, of course, requires a whole different, presentation, lecture. The question that you're asking is how do you get people to seek help or to at least accept help when they are experiencing something terrible that there is a stigma about, right? I think that's a huge other issue. And I think really that kind of issue resides at a different level. In order to, if you want people to reach out for help, you have to get the message across to the whole society that it isn't shameful to talk about domestic violence, okay? And to do that, you need public health messages and many, many efforts in schools, in workplaces that show people that it's okay to talk about domestic violence. And only then will you have people reach out or even accept services. And then it also relates to how services are delivered, right? Or how programs, in what settings services are delivered. This is less of a research question, not really a research question at all. But so, for example, if you, now in the United States, in many doctors' offices, almost every doctor's office now actually, when you come in, they ask you, right, do you feel safe at home, for example? I don't know if that's the case in Indonesia, but so this is one way in which people are exposed over and over again to these kinds of questions. But you can deliver services in doctors' offices, so these are normative places where people get regular health care. It's not stigmatizing. And I think if you can deliver services in those kinds of school settings, for example, then people are more likely to access them.
The model that was created from the hypothesized model is called ADAPT.
Yes.
And there is an application already to the smartphones, right?
Well, we have an app on smartphones for mindfulness practices. The program is available online.
That more
Yeah.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
sure.
It's available.
Is this downloadable?
Um,
Purchase it.
No, it's not for purchase, but it wouldn't, I mean, I could certainly give you access to it, but I think that the online program is going to be very cultural, it won't be culturally relevant, so you can look at it to give you ideas about how it might be relevant. But I actually think, okay, this is probably not a popular thing for an intervention developer to say. I'm not convinced that the online program is different from what I talked about. I talked about a group program. I'm not convinced yet that you can actually change behavior by having people go online. You really want to change behavior, they have to practice, right? And I'm not convinced that you might get highly motivated people to practice by just going online and watching a video, but yeah.
We have time for one more question.
It seems like what I got from this presentation is that if you want the kids to be okay, the parents have to be okay. But have you also considered looking into the role of the children in the parenting practice? Is that one of your future goals, perhaps? Like, could there be something in the children that could also influence the way parents behave towards the children?
That's a great question. Actually, if you, how many of you have access to academic journals through your university or, okay. There's a journal called Development and Psychopathology. It's one of the top developmental journals. It's edited by my colleague Dante Cicchetti, and it has a special issue this month called The Influential Child, which talks about effects from child to parent, what children do that affect parenting. And for sure, all the influences are bidirectional. It's not just that parents influence children. Children influence parents. Children's temperament influences parents. Anyone who has more than one child knows that children are different in their influences, and parents, what I do to one child is different for another, and they in turn, absolutely. What we're trying to do is build up competence. If I feel better as a parent, I'm going to do better, and then in turn my child is going to come back to me, and that's going to make me feel better too, right? But for sure there are many, influences of the child on the parents. Yeah, we actually have, we have a paper in press in Development and Psychopathology that looks at these bidirectional effects from child anxiety and depression to parent PTSD and back to child over a 2-year period.